6 million people, not crossing oceans, not fleeing foreign wars, but moving within their own country searching for dignity, safety, and a future their children could believe in. Between 1915 and 1975, over 6 million African Americans left the Jim Crow South and journeyed to northern and western cities, reshaping the United States in ways that still define our lives today. This was not a single event. It was a quiet revolution, carried out one family at a time. They left behind fields where their labor was exploited, streets where fear shaped daily life, and laws that limited every possibility. What they carried instead were suitcases, hope, and an unshakable belief that life could be different. Trains became pathways to possibility. Cities became symbols of promise, and the nation itself began to change. The Great Migration did more than move people, it transformed music, politics, sports, and culture. It helped create new neighborhoods, new voices, and new leaders. The rhythms of blues and jazz, the rise of modern civil rights movements, and even the political landscape of America all trace their roots to this extraordinary journey. But this story is not only about the past. It is about choices, courage, and the cost of change. It is about ordinary people who decided that staying meant surrender, and leaving meant risk but also hope. Their decisions echo today in our cities, our communities, and our ongoing conversations about justice and opportunity. If you are ready to understand how a movement of millions quietly reshaped a nation, stay with us. And if stories like this matter to you, stories that reveal the hidden forces behind history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we explore the journeys that changed the world. For many African American families, the decision to leave the South was not driven by curiosity or ambition alone, but by a slow, grinding realization that staying meant enduring a life with no room to breathe. The promise that followed emancipation had faded long before the first train tickets were bought. Reconstruction briefly suggested a new beginning, a moment when freedom might translate into land, education, and political voice. But that moment closed almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a system designed to control movement, limit opportunity, and remind black citizens every day of where society insisted they belonged. Jim Crow was not just a set of laws written in legal language. It was an everyday experience that shaped how people walked down a street, entered a store, or spoke in public. It governed schools and workplaces, transportation and housing, turning ordinary actions into potential risks. Economic exploitation reinforced this structure. Sharecropping trapped families in cycles of debt, ensuring that even relentless labor could not produce stability. Each harvest ended with accounts that never quite balanced, keeping workers tied to the same land year after year, with little chance of escape. Beyond the economic pressure lay an atmosphere of constant fear. Racial violence was not random or hidden. It was meant to be seen and understood as a warning. News of attacks traveled quickly through word of mouth, churches, and newspapers, shaping decisions in kitchens and on front porches late at night. Parents taught their children how to lower their eyes, how to speak carefully, how to survive. The cost of a single misstep could be devastating, and the absence of protection from the legal system made the danger feel inescapable. In such conditions, even silence could not guarantee safety. What made these realities unbearable was not only their severity, but their permanence. There was no clear path toward change in the South, no reliable mechanism to challenge injustice or build power. Political participation was blocked, education was deliberately underfunded, and advancement was treated as a threat rather than a right. Over time, endurance turned into exhaustion. The question shifted from whether life could improve where they were, to whether leaving was the only remaining option. Stories from the North and West began to circulate, often carried by letters, newspapers, and returning relatives who spoke of wages paid in cash, schools with real resources, and the simple possibility of walking through a city without constant surveillance. These accounts did not promise perfection, but they offered contrast. Compared to the closed system of the Jim Crow South, even uncertain opportunity felt like freedom. The idea of movement itself became powerful. To leave was to reject the limits imposed on one's life, to claim agency in a society that had long denied it. As these pressures accumulated, migration no longer seemed like a gamble, but a necessity. Families weighed the dangers of the journey against the certainty of remaining trapped. In that calculation, the harsh conditions of the South acted as a relentless push, forcing millions to imagine a future elsewhere. This decision connected directly to the broader story of the Great Migration, transforming private struggles into a collective movement that would reshape American cities, culture, and politics. What began as an effort to survive would become one of the most significant social shifts in the nation's history. As the pressures of the South pushed families to the edge, the North and West began to pull at their imagination with the promise of something different. These places were not described as perfect, but as possible. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and New York appeared in conversations as spaces where effort might finally be rewarded, where the future was not predetermined by birth, and where the rules governing daily life seemed, at least from a distance, less suffocating. For those who had known only restriction, the idea of choice itself became a powerful attraction. Industrial jobs stood at the center of this pull. Northern factories were expanding rapidly, fueled by wartime demand and mass production. Unlike the agricultural economy of the South, factory work offered wages paid in cash and the potential for regular hours. This shift mattered deeply. A steady paycheck meant the ability to plan, to save, and to imagine progress over time rather than survival from season to season. Even the noise and exhaustion of factory floors felt preferable to the endless uncertainty of sharecropping, where labor rarely translated into security. Work in the city suggested dignity through independence, the chance to earn without constant oversight or inherited debt. Education added another layer of hope. In Southern communities, schools for Black children were often underfunded, overcrowded, and designed to limit ambition. Northern cities promised classrooms with better resources, longer school years, and pathways beyond manual labor. Parents saw education not just as learning, but as protection, a way to shield their children from the narrow futures they themselves had endured. The possibility that a child might grow up to become a teacher, a professional, or something not yet imagined gave migration a moral urgency. Leaving became an investment in generations not yet born. Political participation also played a crucial role in shaping these decisions. In the South, voting rights existed largely in theory, blocked by local rules and intimidation that made civic engagement dangerous or impossible. Northern cities offered a different reality. Registration was attainable, ballots were accessible, and Black voters could begin to influence local elections. This shift transformed identity. To vote was to be recognized, to be counted, to belong to the democratic process in a tangible way. Migration turned people who had been silenced into participants, reshaping both personal dignity and collective power. Perhaps the most powerful pull was the promise of personal freedom, subtle yet profound. In the North, there were no guarantees, but there was space to move through public areas with fewer restrictions, to gather in churches and neighborhoods without constant surveillance, and to express ambition without immediate reprisal. Everyday interactions felt different. The ability to walk into a store, apply for a job, or speak openly carried psychological weight. Freedom was not absolute, but it was visible enough to feel real. As these stories spread, the pull of the city grew stronger, intertwining with the push from the South to form an unstoppable current. Migration was no longer an abstract idea. It became a shared direction, a collective leap toward possibility. The movement of millions was shaped not only by what they fled, but by what they dared to imagine. In chasing opportunity, education, voice, and freedom. Black families transformed these cities, in doing, began to redefine the meaning of America itself. As the pressure to leave the South intensified, and the promise of northern cities began to take shape in people's imaginations, one voice rose above the noise and uncertainty to give that dream direction. The Chicago Defender was not just a newspaper. It became a bridge between despair and possibility. At a time when reliable information was scarce and rumors could determine life-altering decisions, its pages carried stories that made migration feel tangible, organized, and achievable. For many families, the Defender was their first sustained glimpse into a world beyond the boundaries of Jim Crow. It described northern cities not as distant abstractions, but as real places with streets, neighborhoods, and jobs waiting to be filled. Articles spoke of factories hiring workers, of wages paid weekly in cash, of schools that stayed open longer and offered more than survival-level education. These accounts did not erase hardship, but they introduced contrast. Compared to the closed system of the South, the North appeared open, dynamic, and filled with movement. The paper transformed curiosity into intention. What gave the Chicago Defender its power was not only what it reported, but how it was shared. Copies moved quietly through barbershops, churches, and kitchens, often read aloud to those who could not read themselves. A single paper might pass through dozens of hands, sparking conversations that stretched late into the night. Families debated routes, destinations, and risks, weighing the familiar against the unknown. In these moments, migration stopped being a solitary fantasy and became a collective plan. The Defender created a shared language of departure. The newspaper also provided something rare and essential: practical guidance. It published train schedules, suggested destinations, and warned readers about obstacles they might face along the way. In doing, it reduced fear by replacing uncertainty with preparation. Leaving no longer felt like stepping into darkness, but like following a path others had already walked. This sense of structure was crucial. Migration required courage, but it also required knowledge, and the Defender offered both. Equally important was the tone the paper set. It spoke to African Americans as citizens with agency, not as victims defined by limitation. Stories emphasized progress, dignity, and collective advancement, reinforcing the idea that leaving the South was not an act of abandonment, but an act of self-determination. This framing mattered deeply. It allowed families to see migration not as a betrayal of home, but as a declaration of worth. The paper insisted that Black lives, labor, and aspirations mattered, and that geography did not have to dictate destiny. Southern authorities recognized the influence of the Chicago Defender and attempted to suppress it, understanding that information itself could disrupt the social order. These efforts only strengthened its symbolic power. To read the paper became an act of quiet resistance, a way of imagining freedom before physically pursuing it. In many households, the Defender was treated with care, folded and saved, its headlines memorized and repeated. By connecting the push of Southern oppression with the pull of Northern opportunity, the Chicago Defender transformed migration into a movement. It synchronized individual decisions into a shared momentum, helping launch the first wave of the Great Migration. Long before families boarded trains, their journeys began on its pages, where hope was printed in ink and possibility traveled faster than rails. Once the decision to leave had been made, and the promise of the North had taken root, the most perilous chapter of the Great Migration began. Departure itself often unfolded in silence. Families understood that announcing their plans could invite retaliation, so they packed in secret, choosing nighttime for their exit. Familiar homes were abandoned without farewells, and generations of memory were left behind in a matter of hours. What they carried was limited, but the weight of what they were risking was immense. Leaving meant stepping away from everything known in exchange for an uncertain future shaped only by hope. The journey north exposed migrants to new forms of vulnerability. Trains, symbols of progress and connection, became spaces of tension. Segregated travel pushed black passengers into overcrowded, poorly maintained cars, often located near engines where smoke and soot filled the air. Access to food and restrooms was restricted, forcing families to prepare carefully, packing meals and planning every detail in advance. Children sensed the anxiety even when adults tried to mask it, learning early that this journey demanded discipline, patience, and quiet endurance. Despite these conditions, the train also carried profound symbolism. Each mile traveled represented distance from the rigid hierarchy of the South. When migrants crossed key geographic markers, such as major rivers dividing regions, the atmosphere often shifted. Conversations softened, shoulders relaxed, and in some cases, songs emerged. These moments were fragile but powerful, offering emotional release after years of controlled expression. The train became a moving threshold between what had been endured and what might be possible. Emotional risk accompanied every physical step. Parents wrestled with doubt, questioning whether they were protecting their children or exposing them to new dangers. The North existed largely as an idea shaped by stories, newspapers, and letters, not lived experience. Arrival did not guarantee shelter, work, or welcome. Families prepared themselves for rejection even as they dreamed of acceptance. This tension defined the journey, blending courage with fear in equal measure. For many, the act of travel itself reshaped identity. To move was to assert agency in a system that had long denied it. Even under restrictive conditions, simply being in motion carried psychological significance. Migrants were no longer waiting for change. They were creating it through action. The journey demanded resilience, adaptability, and trust within families, strengthening bonds forged under pressure. Arrival in northern cities brought relief, but also disorientation. Train stations were crowded and unfamiliar, filled with noise, strangers, and decisions that needed to be made immediately. Where to sleep, whom to trust, how to navigate a new environment, all of it unfolded at once. Yet the journey had already accomplished something irreversible. By surviving it, migrants proved to themselves that they could endure uncertainty and claim control over their own lives. The dangerous and uncertain journey north connected directly to the forces that pushed families out of the South and the hopes that pulled them toward the city. It was the physical expression of a larger transformation, turning private desperation into collective movement. Each secret departure, each mile traveled, contributed to a shared story of courage that would reshape American society long after the trains reached their final stops. Arrival in northern cities marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with promise yet shadowed by persistent challenges that tested the resilience of African American families. The streets of Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and New York offered the possibility of employment, education, and political engagement, but these opportunities came wrapped in a complex reality that was far from the equality that migrants had dreamed of. Housing, for instance, became a battleground of exclusion and resistance. Many northern neighborhoods were closed off to black families through restrictive covenants, intimidation, and discriminatory real estate practices, forcing entire communities into crowded, under-resourced areas where access to quality services was limited. The promise of the North was real but selective, creating pockets of possibility surrounded by walls of prejudice. Economic opportunities, though more abundant than in the South, were also fraught with inequality. African Americans often found themselves in industrial jobs with long hours, low pay, and little chance for advancement, while white colleagues benefited from better conditions and upward mobility. Even those who managed to secure skilled positions or start small businesses faced barriers to credit, insurance, and networks that could allow their enterprises to thrive. Success required navigating a landscape where institutional bias shaped every interaction, demanding a constant negotiation between ambition and survival. Racial tension occasionally erupted into violence, reminding migrants that geography did not erase the legacy of Jim Crow. Riots in cities like Chicago illustrated the fragility of Northern tolerance, where any assertion of equality could trigger hostility from white residents determined to preserve their social dominance. Families experienced firsthand the dangers of asserting their right to live and work freely, and the urban landscape became a mirror of both hope and ongoing struggle. These incidents reinforced that migration was not simply a journey to safety, but a calculated leap into a space where freedom was provisional, contested, and sometimes violently challenged. Despite these obstacles, Northern cities offered African Americans a platform to build community and cultivate culture in ways that were previously impossible. Churches, social clubs, schools, and newspapers became anchors for families navigating the new environment, providing support, solidarity, and the dissemination of critical information. Music, art, and literature flourished as the cultural contributions of the Great Migration reshaped the social fabric of the nation. Jazz, blues, and gospel spread from neighborhood to neighborhood, transforming both local and national culture, while local activism laid the groundwork for political engagement and civil rights advocacy. The tension between opportunity and persistent inequality also created a profound lesson in resilience and strategy. Migrants learned to leverage the resources available while simultaneously challenging systemic barriers. Education became a vehicle for upward mobility, political organizing a tool for influence, and cultural expression a way to assert identity and demand recognition. Every step forward required navigating a complex interplay of hope, risk, and resistance, highlighting that the North's promise was real but incomplete. Migration, therefore, was a story of duality. It created openings for progress while revealing the persistence of structural racism. Families who crossed rivers and boarded trains did so with the understanding that freedom was never absolute, and that the fight for justice would continue even after reaching what they had imagined as a promised land. In navigating housing segregation, economic discrimination, and racial hostility, they forged a blueprint of resilience, adaptability, and community building that would influence generations to come, illustrating that transformation is as much about endurance and ingenuity as it is about geography. As African American families settled into northern cities, they carried with them not only their hopes and ambitions, but also a rich cultural heritage that would soon reshape the very fabric of American life. The migration brought forth an unprecedented convergence of talent, creativity, and determination, creating fertile ground for innovation in music, sports, and the arts. In the bustling neighborhoods of Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Cleveland, the rhythms of the South met the dynamism of the urban North, giving rise to cultural expressions that were both deeply rooted in African American experience and strikingly transformative for the wider nation. Music became one of the most visible and influential arenas of this transformation. The blues, born in the Mississippi Delta, found new audiences in northern cities, resonating with the struggles, hopes, and resilience of a people seeking to redefine their lives. Jazz, carried up the Mississippi River and out of New Orleans, introduced improvisation and virtuosity that challenged musical conventions and inspired generations of performers. Gospel music from black churches imbued communities with spiritual strength, while the energetic beats and lyrical storytelling of emerging R&B and soul anticipated the cultural explosion of Motown. Detroit, in particular, became the epicenter of this movement, where Berry Gordy transformed a modest garage into Hitsville, U.S., nurturing talents like the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, and The Temptations. Motown was not just a record label. It was a cultural institution that bridged racial divides, popularized black artistry nationwide, and gave the world a sound that would define an era. Sports, too, were deeply affected by the migration. Jess Owens' journey from the segregated fields of Alabama to Olympic glory in Berlin exemplified the possibilities and challenges of Northern life. Owens' victories were more than personal triumphs. They symbolized the potential of a generation liberated from the harshest restrictions of the South, even as systemic racism persisted in the North. Similarly, Jackie Robinson's migration with his family to California paved the way for him to break Major League Baseball's color barrier. Robinson's courage on and off the field reflected the broader struggle for recognition and equality, illustrating how the movement of people northward was inseparable from the emergence of black excellence in public life. Artistic expression flourished alongside music and sports. African American writers, painters, and performers found in northern cities communities that nurtured their voices, giving rise to a cultural renaissance that resonated far beyond city limits. Neighborhood theaters, literary salons, and art exhibitions became hubs where new ideas mingled with traditional forms, creating a legacy of creativity that would influence American culture for decades. The streets themselves became stages for innovation. Murals, public performances, and vibrant street culture all contributed to a shared sense of identity and pride, reflecting both the hardships endured and the victories achieved. The impact of the Great Migration on American culture was profound because it intertwined personal stories with collective transformation. Each artist, athlete, and musician carried the weight of a community's aspirations and the memory of a past marked by oppression, channeling it into performances that inspired audiences and challenged societal norms. Music, sports, and the arts became vehicles not just for entertainment but for visibility, empowerment, and social change, demonstrating how cultural contributions could alter perceptions, open doors, and influence generations. The migration reshaped American culture not as an isolated phenomenon but as a sweeping narrative of resilience, creativity, and the relentless pursuit of progress, leaving a legacy that continues to resonate in every note, every victory, and every work of art. As African American families established themselves in northern and western cities, the consequences of the Great Migration extended far beyond the cultural and economic spheres, reshaping the political landscape of the United States in ways that are still felt today. The movement of millions of black Americans into urban centers dramatically altered voting patterns, creating new concentrations of political influence that challenged long-standing power structures. Cities such as Chicago, Detroit, New York, Cleveland, and Philadelphia became hubs of black political activity, where newly enfranchised communities could collectively advocate for change and demand representation. The sheer scale of this demographic shift meant that black voices could no longer be ignored, and political leaders began to take notice, often for the first time. Local elections, city councils, and even national contests were increasingly shaped by the priorities and needs of these migrating communities. This newfound political leverage also fueled the momentum of the civil rights movement. Leaders like Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and later figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., were able to harness the energy and organization of northern black communities to advance campaigns for equality, integration, and justice. Marches, voter registration drives, and coordinated advocacy were strengthened by the urban networks that migration had helped establish, creating a foundation for collective action that crossed regional boundaries. The experiences of migrants, both the systemic challenges they faced in housing, employment, and public life, and the cultural vibrancy they brought to their new cities, provided compelling evidence of the need for comprehensive civil rights legislation, influencing landmark legal victories and legislative reforms. In addition to collective activism, the Great Migration enabled the rise of Black political leadership at multiple levels. Figures such as Cor Stokes, the first African-American mayor of a major U.S. city in Cleveland, and Harold Washington, later mayor of Chicago, demonstrated that sustained political engagement could translate into real power and influence. These leaders emerged from communities built by migration, reflecting the priorities and resilience of those who had moved north in search of opportunity and dignity. Their successes inspired subsequent generations to pursue office, ensuring that Black Americans could shape policy, advocate for equitable education, fight economic discrimination, and challenge systemic injustice from within the political system itself. Even today, the legacy of the Great Migration continues to influence struggles for racial justice, contemporary movements for voting rights, police reform, and equitable housing are built on foundations laid by those who first moved north, asserting their right to participate fully in the democratic process. The migration's impact reminds us that demographic shifts are not just about numbers, they are about the capacity to organize, to advocate, and to transform society through sustained civic engagement. It highlights the interconnectedness of cultural, economic, and political change, showing how the pursuit of freedom and opportunity in one era can ripple forward to shape the possibilities of the next. Thank you so much for joining this journey into one of the most transformative periods in American history. If you found this story inspiring and want to explore more tales of resilience, culture, and justice, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history that shaped the world we live in today. Your support helps keep these important stories alive and accessible. And together, we can continue learning from the past to understand the present and influence the future.